The collection of works from the Middle Ages housed in these former palaces of the Tsars spans from about the 5th century, shortly after the fall of Rome, to the 15th century. It was a time of dragons and knights, crusades and pilgrimages, chivalry and feudalism. During the Middle Ages, the nations of Europe were formed. The epoch began with a period of barbarism. Warring tribes such as the Visigoths, the Huns, and the Vikings destroyed in the course of 300 years what the Greeks and Romans had taken 3,000 years to build. It was not until about the year 1000 that some semblance of order settled over Europe. The new powers were the feudal lords and the church. For the vast majority, there was only one faith, the Christian faith, and the Church could offer or deny to each man and woman eternal life. Emphasis shifted from the present to the glories of the hereafter. There was little interest in realistic images of the world. The human body itself was considered not beautiful, but corrupt. So the figures in artistic works like this processional cross were symbolic rather than naturalistic. It is believed that this piece dates from the 11th century. The bejeweled gold cross was carried to the altar as part of a church ceremony. The image of Christ who sacrificed his life to save mankind is the central theme of medieval art. St. John and Mary stand by his side in this German Bible cover. The cosmic scope of Christ's domain, the heavens as well as the earth, is represented by the sun and the moon above his head. Because of the widespread illiteracy of the population, clearly understood symbols were carved into religious works. Signs of the 4 evangelists mark the corners, while Christ sits on a rainbow surrounded by an almond-shaped mandola of divine rays. In the 10th to the 12th centuries, Romanesque was the predominant architectural style. It was based on the rounded Roman arch. Churches were dark and austere. The only usual decoration would be a sculptural relief surrounding the main door or portal. St. Stephen was the first of 7 deacons appointed by the apostles to head the new Christian church. He was one of the first martyrs, stoned to death after a sermon in which he accused the council in Jerusalem of murdering Christ. This work is a reliquary, meaning that it contains a chamber to hold holy relics, such as the frayed hem of the Virgin's robe. Churches would compete for such items which were believed to work miracles. Thousands went on crusades in search of these relics. St. Stephen holds in his hands a small case containing the relic. The head is often emphasized in Romanesque statuary. It was considered the home of the spirit. The work may look like solid gold, but actually it has a core of wood, covered with silver, then gilt. Reliquaries designed to hold the remains of saints were shaped as parts of the human body. We can tell from the sleeve of the vestments that the saint was a bishop. Notice the perfect naturalism of this sculpted hand. It shows that medieval artists were quite capable of rendering 3-dimensional forms when they believed it appropriate. Because of the technique of setting the colored stones, the work is thought to have been done by a 12th century jeweler. Antique cameos are among the stones. Lavish gold and silver liturgical objects were designed to lead church members to appreciate divine beauty through material splendor. They were the earthly counterpart to the eternal beauty of the city of God, heavenly Jerusalem or paradise. This piece probably dates from the earliest years of the Middle Ages, a time of barbarism. Clues to its age are the artist's use of the acanthus leaves and other tiny classical motifs, holdovers from the now dead Roman Empire. These elements fell into disuse in the later years of the Middle Ages. Because arms of equal length form the cross, we identify the work as a Greek cross. The Latin cross has a long vertical arm and a short horizontal arm. Greek crosses were usually outfitted with a short handle and used for benedictions. It embodied the miracle-working powers of Christ. The meaning behind the decorated crosier, or pastoral staff, originated in the civilization of ancient Greece. It was Apollo's attribute as guardian of the flocks. In liturgical services, church leaders would carry the crosier as their processional staff. Medieval artists' love intertwined forms such as one animal biting another. In general, the snake is the symbol of evil, but in this case it symbolizes prudence, cautioning the flock to be wary of sin. Beginning in the 9th century, pilgrims began to travel throughout Europe to visit holy relics in search of salvation. The French town of Limoges had one of the 5 great pilgrimage churches of Europe along what was called the Pilgrimage Road. Limoges artisans became famous for the elaborate and beautiful reliquaries they produced. This one tells the story of Saint Valerie, a woman from Limoges. After being beheaded by the Romans, Saint Valerie miraculously carried her own head to the church. Here the Roman council tries to force the citizens of Limoges to worship pagan gods. A butcher executes Valerie for her refusal. Though beautifully crafted, reliquaries still remained, in essence, miniature sarcophagi, designed to hold the remnants of a dead saint, and perhaps also to remind the viewer of his own mortality. The architectural details reflected the Romanesque style of the day. Limoges reliquaries were primarily made from copper panels. Artisans pounded depressions into the copper to hold the enamel chips. When the piece was baked, the chips melted into the depression, leaving a gem-like pool of colored glass nearly equal in brilliance to a precious stone. Great numbers of these reliquaries were turned out in the 12th and 13th centuries. By this time, many of the relics they were made to hold were brought back from the Near East by the Crusaders. This one shows Mary, Queen of Heaven, surrounded by angels. Reliquaries were often made of costly materials, and the labor involved in each image was extensive. The amount of enamel work and the number of precious gems depended upon the wealth of the church congregation who commissioned it. This piece shows Christ as the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. The lamb symbolizes the sinner who may stray from the flock. Christ is the Good Shepherd. In the Middle Ages, monasteries dotted the continent. They began as self-sufficient refuges of learning and contemplation in an unsafe world. Limoges artists created covers for the monks' beautiful, hand-lettered, illustrated Bibles. This center for religious art also produced sculpture. You might notice that French artists nearly always showed the Virgin wearing a crown. The French admiration of king and court was growing, even in the Middle Ages. Although art served the Church almost exclusively in this era, some articles for secular life were created too. These were often fanciful and imaginative. This aquamanile, shaped as a head, would have been used to hold water at banquets. Here is a bronze statuette of a knight hunting. Behind the knight sits a cheetah, his assistant in the hunt. Although his form is generalized, the knight is represented in full combat armor. This next washing jug of a knight fighting a dragon is an example of the Gothic style being born in the Romanesque. The figures are full of expression and life, with rather regular proportions that testify to the new abilities of Gothic artists to use their powers of observation. The impetus behind Gothic architecture was the association of spirituality with light. Figures began to look more rounded and lifelike. Architects strove to make their churches reach up to the heavens. Tapering spires of the cathedral stretched upwards to the heavenly world. This fragment of a wooden altar is executed in a late Gothic style called flamboyant. Because there were no engineering calculations, the builders had no idea how high was too high or how many windows were too many. Beauvais, the highest French cathedral, collapsed while in construction and had to be rebuilt. No town building was allowed to be higher than the cathedral, and each town strove to build the highest cathedral as a matter of civic pride. One of the highlights of the Hermitage collection of religious medieval art is the 13th century processional cross you are about to see. The figures in this work are quite three-dimensional. The piece is elaborately ornate and sophisticated. Each separate portion of the cross carries its own message. It is embedded with many fine gems and lavishly gilded. Above Christ's head, the Virgin and St. John stand beside a cross with images of the sun and moon above. On the top, Christ is depicted as King of Heaven on his throne. This female figure is a personification of synagogue. Her staff is broken, and she is downcast, suggesting defeat. On the opposite arm of the cross is a personification of the Church triumphant. In the Gothic era, we see the reality of the human figure, the suffering from physical pain. Anatomical details are more correct. Gems are skillfully set, and tiny leaves show tremendous interest in intricate detail. In the Middle Ages, art's main purpose was to transport the viewer to a world of divine and beautiful reverence. Although proportions are elongated, the bodies are naturalistic-looking. The Virgin and St. John stand on either side of Christ. They suffer as would a mortal man or woman. The many tiny leaves make reference to the trees of life and knowledge in the Garden of Eden. The tree of life conferred immortality. The tree of knowledge, wisdom, but along with that wisdom came loss of innocence. The cult of the Virgin swept across Europe in the Middle Ages. People saw her as accessible, human, and understanding, an intercessor for the human race. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to pray before the reliquaries containing mere fragments of her personal effects. She was also the object of courtly love, poetry, and ballads, just as the lady of the manor might be to the knights who served her. In the Gothic era, a more rounded and human Mary began to emerge. The baby often holds a pomegranate, a symbol of resurrection. In classical times, the pomegranate was associated with Persephone, who returned to regenerate the earth every spring. Mary seems congenial, even smiling. Originally, these ivory carvings were painted and gilded, as were the relief figures on this folding altar, but they have never lost their power as art. Christ in heaven is at the peak. To the right, below, are grieving souls denied entrance. To the left are the joyous souls. You see images of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion, and then scenes from his birth. On the right, the Annunciation, then the Nativity in Bethlehem, and the three wise men. Another panel shows the flight into Egypt from King Herod's threats. These small folding altarpieces were designed for portability. They were known to have been carried by traveling monks and may have accompanied crusading knights. This elaborate 14th century work is called a monstrance. The word comes from the Latin meaning to show. It's a liturgical vessel designed to display the host for the feast of Corpus Christi. Reliquaries were made as before in the shape of a church. But by this era, the simple, austere Romanesque style had been replaced by the Gothic. The painted images that decorated the flat-walled Romanesque reliquaries are now replaced by the lacy and ornate elements of the structure of a real Gothic church. The reliquaries of this epoch are delicate confections of tracery, spires and flying buttresses reaching toward the heavens. Many of these pieces were crowned with lovely miniature statuary. The reliquaries and liturgical works of the Gothic era are light, graceful expressions of deep piety, optimism, and faith. Their fantastic variety is a testimonial to the imaginations of their creators, who were usually artisans united in guilds. The guilds did more than produce church works. They ensured a high level of craftsmanship by their members and protected them from non-payment. They built furniture, made carpets, and forged arms. The Hermitage has a large and fascinating collection of armor. It would seem from the writings of medieval Europe that peacetime in the dank castle was quite dull. War, at least in the abstract, became a gentleman's joy. Young noblemen were trained in fighting from childhood. The best attained knighthood, which turned out to be more than a vocation. It was an entire way of life, complete with rules for moral behavior, known as the Code of Chivalry. The 12th century English philosopher John of Salisbury wrote that the duty of a knight was to protect the church, fight against injustice, give reverence to priesthood, and, if need be, lay down your life. This shield depicts St. George fighting the dragon. By the 13th century, the dubbing of a knight involved an elaborate ceremony which could take more than a day. The candidate was bathed, then dressed in white clothes with a red robe. For 10 hours he stood or knelt in silence before the altar of weapons. Finally, at dawn, a mass was said for him, and he was presented to the Lord. The Lord gave him his armor, and each piece was blessed as he put it on. Last and most important were his spurs. After they were strapped on, an elder knight would strike him one hard blow. This was the last he was expected to endure without return. From this part of the ceremony comes the phrase, "He has won his spurs." The knight then vowed to fight against evil and defend the weak and the poor. Games, jousting, and mock duels ended the day. Knights served their nobles by waging war for short periods against rival nobles. This armor bears the crest of the Order of St. Jacob, one of the most powerful orders. In large-scale wars, such as France's conquest of England and the Crusades, all the knights of the land would disappear in battle for periods of months or years, many never to return. The arbalest was a high-powered bow that could pierce armor from 70 paces. Eventually, muskets, pistols, and cannons replaced the arbalest. But the firearms were heavy. The firearms and the armor of one knight might weigh as much as 100 pounds, so special light armor was worn when fighting on foot or in tournaments where maneuverability was required. Much of the fighting close to home took place under prescribed rules. If a knight were captured, for example, he was not killed. A ransom would be paid for his return. By contrast, the Crusades or Holy Wars were deadly struggles in which thousands upon thousands lost their lives. From the 11th to the 13th centuries, successive waves of knights, peasants, and even children journeyed to the Middle East to retake the Holy Land from the Arabs and the Turks. In the end, not 1 acre of the Holy Land was gained, but thousands were slaughtered, and the Christians and Muslims developed into bitter enemies. The only ones who benefited were the European merchants. Through their involvement, they developed profitable trade routes with the Near East. Merchants eventually would eclipse the power of the lords, to replace the feudal system with a more capitalist culture, making possible the Renaissance in Europe. The artists and craftsmen of the Middle Ages lived in a time of faith and feudalism. The beautiful creations in the Hermitage bear witness to the magical beliefs of an era when the Church and the lords brought order in a land of chaos.